And welcome back to room 303 in Freshman English. I'm with you in your hymnal on page 100, 101 and following. We're going to be looking now at two texts, a White House diary of Lady Bird Johnson and a text called My English that we'll be working with Julio Alvarez. We'll get to that one later. Let's turn, however, to page 101 and at 2b. You notice how regularly we start our study of these texts at 2b. And in 2b, we're looking at the literary analysis voice. Let's make sure you have that written down. Let's make sure that you have a definition of voice on page 101. Read it with me. Page 101. Voice is the way a writer sounds on the page. It's related to both the author's point of view, we talked about that in a prior lecture, his or her unique way of seeing a topic, and his or her style or distinct way of using language. For example, a writer's voice may be sophisticated, blunt, or breathless. The following elements contribute to an author's voice. We want to write this down. Word choice matters. Tone or attitude matters. Sentence structure matters. Voice, we'll point out, is a key element in autobiographical writing. You want to write that one down. Now wait a minute, let's get this one out of the way. I've had freshmen sometimes that say, I'm a little confused still by this. What is the difference between biography and autobiography? Simple. The letters auto means about oneself. So in other words, an autobiography, somebody is writing about themselves, they will use the first person pronoun I. I went to this school, I did this thing, whatever. Biography is written by somebody else. For example, if later in your life somebody writes your life story, that is a biography. They're writing about you. Okay, that's the distinction. Under author's purpose in reading skill on page 101, we'll be looking here the main purpose for the writing, and we'll want to make sure that we want to preview the text, noticing information ideas conveyed in the title, for example, organizing features such as subheads, identify the subject of photos, illustrations, diagrams, and the like. On to page 102, we're back to our Unit 1 question, can truth change? And there's vocabulary provided for you there. You definitely want to pay attention to that vocabulary as you prepare for our assessment. Let's look at page 103 now. We're going to meet Lady Bird Johnson. We're going to write down dates quickly, 1912 to 2007. So in other words, she died fairly recently. Okay, so that kind of helps us think about this writer. Texas-born Claudia Atla Taylor received her nickname when a nurse said the 2-year-old was as pretty as a ladybird. A graduate of the University of Texas, Lady Bird met and married Lyndon Johnson. So write that down. We are talking about the wife of Lyndon Johnson, then a young congressional aide in 1934. Even though she was a shy woman, Lady Bird was a valued advisor and effective campaigner for her husband, who said that voters, quote, would happily have elected her over me, end quote. When President Kennedy was assassinated, Vice President Lyndon Johnson became president, and Lady Bird became First Lady of the United States. In this role, she made many contributions to her husband's agenda, including the launch of Head Start, which is an important educational program. Let's write that down. A project that makes early childhood education available to all children. I've had a number of freshmen who have read this text. They go, oh, no way, I was a part of Head Start when I was a little kid. You have Lady Bird Johnson to thank for that, the woman that we'll be reading. By the way, the Did You Know final, in 1982, Lady Bird Johnson founded the National Wildflower Research Center in Austin, Texas. So you can see that her interests go all over the place. For some background information, the assassination of JFK, we obviously want this information in our notes. Several times in our freshman year, we're going to come back to this pivotal day in American history. The day that an American president was shot and killed on the streets of Dallas. And if you have a chance to visit the city of Dallas in Texas, I hope that you can go and visit. There's a great museum right there, and it's quite remarkable to have an opportunity to stand where history was made. I'm reading on page 103. President John F. Kennedy was a young, vibrant, popular leader who had been elected in 1960. His assassination, here's the date, write it down, November 22, 1963. That's an important date for this study as well. It was a stunning, unforgettable event. As the news media reported the tragedy, people wept openly in the streets. A mournful nation agreed with Lyndon B. Johnson, JFK's successor, when he said, "We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed." Let's turn now to the reading. Notice right away we are going to preview the text. Do you see it? On page 105, at the very top, notice you've got a heading. Dallas, Friday, November 22nd, 1963. Notice at the bottom, you've got a timeline. Do you see it? Turn the page. We've got some literature in context with some important information on the legacy of JFK on 106. And then on 107, more of the timeline. In other words, trying to give you a sense of how that day unfolded. Continuing on page 108 to 109, more of the same. Do you see it? So as we pay attention to the reading of this text, we want to as well kind of tie in some of the images that are available there for us. By the way, page 104, that image with John F. Kennedy sitting in the back of that limo, you're looking at it with me on page 104. That image was taken just a few moments before he was shot as he was driving in the open limousine, in the open car. Okay? All right, let's go ahead and now go to the reading. Page 105. Let's just follow along again, paying close attention to this understanding of this day, this autobiographical incident. Here we go.
From A White House Diary by Lady Bird Johnson. Dallas, Friday, November 22nd, 1963. It all began so beautifully. After a drizzle in the morning, the sun came out bright and clear. We were driving into Dallas. In the lead car were President and Mrs. Kennedy, John and Nellie Connally, a Secret Service car full of men, and then our car with Lyndon and me and Senator Ralph Yarborough. The streets were lined with people, lots and lots of people, the children all smiling, placards, confetti, people waving from windows. One last happy moment I had was looking up and seeing Mary Griffith leaning out of a window waving at me. Mary, for many years, had been in charge of altering the clothes which I purchased at Neiman Marcus. Then, almost at the edge of town, on our way to the Trade Mart for the presidential luncheon, we were rounding a curve, going down a hill, and suddenly there was a sharp, loud report. It sounded like a shot. The sound seemed to me to come from a building on the right above my shoulder. A moment passed, and then two more shots rang out in rapid succession. There had been such a gala air about the day that I thought the noise must come from firecrackers, part of the celebration. Then the Secret Service men were suddenly down in the lead car. Over the car radio system I heard, "Let's get out of here," and our Secret Service man, Rufus Youngblood, vaulted over the front seat on top of Lyndon, threw him to the floor, and said, "Get down." Senator Yarborough and I ducked our heads. The car accelerated terrifically, faster and faster. Then suddenly the brakes were put on so hard that I wondered if we were going to make it as we wheeled left and went around the corner. We pulled up to a building. I looked up and saw a sign, "Hospital." Only then did I believe that this might be what it was. Senator Yarborough kept saying in an excited voice, "Have they shot the president? Have they shot the president?" I said something like, "No, it can't be." As we ground to a halt, we were still the third car, Secret Service men began to pull, lead, guide, and hustle us out. I cast one last look over my shoulder and saw in the president's car a bundle of pink, just like a drift of blossoms, lying on the back seat. It was Mrs. Kennedy lying over the president's body. The Secret Service men rushed us to the right, then to the left, and then onward into a quiet room in the hospital, a very small room. It was lined with white sheets, I believe. People came and went. Kenny O'Donnell, the president's top aide, Congressman Homer Thornberry, Congressman Jack Brooks. Always there was Rufy right there, and other Secret Service agents, Emory Roberts, Jerry Kivett, Lem Johns, and Woody Taylor. People spoke of how widespread this might be. There was talk about where we would go, to the plane, to our house, back to Washington. Through it all, Lyndon was remarkably calm and quiet. He suggested that the presidential plane ought to be moved to another part of the field. He spoke of going back out to the plane in unmarked black cars. Every face that came in, you searched for the answer. I think the face I kept seeing the answer on was the face of Kenny O'Donnell, who loved President Kennedy so much. It was Lyndon who spoke of it first, although I knew I would not leave without doing it. He said, "You had better try to see Jackie and Nellie." We didn't know what had happened to John. I asked the Secret Service if I could be taken to them. They began to lead me up one corridor and down another. Suddenly, I found myself face to face with Jackie in a small hallway. I believe it was right outside the operating room. You always think of someone like her as being insulated, protected. She was quite alone. I don't think I ever saw anyone so much alone in my life. I went up to her, put my arms around her, and said something to her. I'm sure it was something like, "God help us all," because my feelings for her were too tumultuous to put into words. And then I went to see Nellie. There it was different, because Nellie and I have gone through so many things together since 1938. I hugged her tight, and we both cried, and I said, "Nellie, John's going to be all right." And Nellie said, "Yes, John's going to be all right." Among her many other fine qualities, she is also strong. I turned and went back to the small white room where Lyndon was. Matt Kilduff, the president's press man on this trip, and Kenny O'Donnell were coming and going. I think it was from Kenny's face that I first knew the truth, and from Kenny's voice that I first heard the words, "The president is dead." Mr. Kilduff entered and said to Lyndon, "Mr. President." It was decided that we would go immediately to the airport. Hurried plans were made about how we should get to the cars and who was to ride in which car. Our departure from the hospital and approach to the cars was one of the swiftest walks I have ever made. We got in. Lyndon told the agents to stop the sirens. We drove along as fast as we could. I looked up at a building, and there, already, was a flag at half-mast. I think that was when the enormity of what had happened first struck me. When we got to the field, we entered Air Force One for the first time. There was a TV set on, and the commentator was saying, "Lyndon B. Johnson, now President of the United States." The news commentator was saying the president had been shot with a .30-30 rifle. The police had a suspect. They were not sure he was the assassin. On the plane, all the shades were lowered. We heard that we were going to wait for Mrs. Kennedy in the coffin. There was a telephone call to Washington, I believe to the Attorney General. It was decided that Lyndon should be sworn in here as quickly as possible because of national and world implications, and because we did not know how widespread this was as to intended victims. Judge Sarah Hughes, a federal judge in Dallas, and I am glad it was she, was called and asked to come in a hurry to administer the oath. Mrs. Kennedy had arrived by this time, as had the coffin. There, in the very narrow confines of the plane, with Jackie standing by Lyndon, her hair falling in her face but very composed, with me beside him, Judge Hughes in front of him, and a cluster of Secret Service people, staff, and congressmen we had known for a long time around him, Lyndon took the oath of office. It's odd, the little things that come to your mind at times of utmost stress, the flashes of deep compassion you feel for people who are really not at the center of the tragedy. I heard a Secret Service man say in the most desolate voice, and I hurt for him, "We never lost a president in the service." Then, Police Chief Curry of Dallas came on the plane and said, "Mrs. Kennedy, believe me, we did everything we possibly could." That must have been an agonizing moment for him. We all sat around the plane. The casket was in the corridor. I went in the small private room to see Mrs. Kennedy, and though it was a very hard thing to do, she made it as easy as possible. She said things like, "Oh, Lady Bird, we've liked you two so much." Oh, what if I had not been there? I'm so glad I was there. I looked at her. Mrs. Kennedy's dress was stained with blood. One leg was almost entirely covered with it, and her right glove was caked. It was caked with blood. Her husband's blood. Somehow, that was one of the most poignant sights. That immaculate woman, exquisitely dressed and caked in blood. I asked her if I couldn't get someone in to help her change, and she said, "Oh no, perhaps later I'll ask Mary Gallagher, but not right now." And then with almost an element of fierceness, if a person that gentle, that dignified can be said to have such a quality, she said, "I want them to see what they have done to Jack." I tried to express how we felt. I said, "Oh, Mrs. Kennedy, you know we never even wanted to be vice president, and now, dear God, it's come to this." I would have done anything to help her, but there was nothing I could do, so rather quickly I left and went back to the main part of the airplane where everyone was seated. The flight to Washington was silent, each sitting with his own thoughts. One of mine was a recollection of what I had said about Lyndon a long time ago. He's a good man in a tight spot. I remembered one little thing he had said in that hospital room. Tell the children to get a Secret Service man with them. Finally, we got to Washington, with a cluster of people waiting and many bright lights. The casket went off first, then Mrs. Kennedy, and then we followed. The family had come to join her. Lyndon made a very simple, very brief, and I think strong statement to the people there. Only about 4 sentences. We got in helicopters, dropped him off at the White House, and I came home in a car with Liz Carpenter.
All right, let's turn now to the study of this autobiographic, this diary, piece of writing, about a day that many have argued in America's history is one of the most tragic of all days. Of course, you have a sense of that as you read this. Now, I'm going to go back to 2B for just a moment. You've written it in your notes already. Our focus is on voice, right? Voice. So we are at 2B talking about voice. Now, when we ask about what kind of voice it is that we are going to see in this text, we have several adjectives which immediately come to mind. One is, of course, let's write it down, respectful. Lady Bird is clearly wanting to say that both John F. Kennedy, as well as his wife Jackie, were amazing people. And she wants to show that level of respect and reverence for them. We'll comment on the ways that she does that. Number 2, not only is the voice reverential, but it's also showing respect. But it's also, of course, tragic. It's almost a stunning kind of voice of tragedy, right? Like, I can't believe this actually happened. Notice from the very first line, I'm on page 105 now, it all began so beautifully. The irony, let's put that one in our notes. The irony, of course, is that this day, weather-wise, was so remarkably beautiful. Then, we're told about all of the people, lots and lots of people, and everyone's smiling. And it's a happy moment, and yet, in the moment of all of that, the word suddenly, on page 105, third paragraph. Suddenly, there was a sharp, loud report, a report echo, right? It sounded like a shot. Note the irony as well. Because everyone's so happy, and many people reported this, by the way, from that moment, there were a number of people who thought it was firecrackers that were being kind of, shot off because they were excited or happy, because the time was so happy. The next part of the entry, of course, is what happens immediately afterwards. Notice how, let's put this in our notes, she works kind of methodically. First this happened, then this happened, then this happened. As she's going through, she makes some observations. On page 106, we are at the hospital, right? Notice that it's right away not sure exactly what's going on. There's confusion, and she's trying to share that confusion. Many readers of this have pointed out that the most poignant, the most powerful moment in the entire reading happens on page 106. As she is being led away from her car into the hospital, she has one last look over her shoulder. She says, I cast one last look over my shoulder and saw in the president's car a bundle of pink, just like a drift of blossoms. Notice the powerful simile, right? Comparison using like or as. Like a drift of blossoms lying on the back seat. It was Mrs. Kennedy lying over the president's body. The power of this single line is that she comes back to this line later in the diary entry by pointing out that the wife, Mrs. Kennedy, is covered in blood. And of course covered in blood because she was holding on to the body of her husband. This, let's put it in our notes, does what for you as a reader of this text? Many have said it gives that human element. It's one thing to say the president was assassinated, yes? It's another thing to give a report like this that's very personal. Of course, she also will celebrate the names of a number of the Secret Service agents. We normally don't think of this. Let's put this in our notes. The ways in which people immediately had different responses to the killing of the president. If you are a Secret Service agent and your job is to take care of the president's life and the president is shot under your watch, you cannot help but feel a certain kind of guilt, a certain level of, we should have done more. Notice that when the Dallas police chief comes onto the plane, the first thing he says is, we did everything that we could do. There's a sense of impending, oh no, we're going to have to answer for this. We often don't think about that, but the people in charge are the ones who, of course, have tremendous responsibility.